everyone, my name is Tegan Aldridge. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Darkin Young people as the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and thank them for welcoming myself onto their country. I welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples we have with us today, and I pay my respect to all elders past, present and emerging. I will be concluding today's presentation by critically discussing the effectiveness of responses to violence against Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander peoples, women and their communities. The Crimes, Domestic and Personal Violence Act 2007 protects persons from domestic and personal violence within the state of New South Wales. The Act sets out key definitions, such as defining what an apprehended violence order is. It defines domestic relationship and defines domestic violence offences. A complicating factor compared to other Australian jurisdictions is that within New South Wales legislation, there is no specific definition of what domestic violence is. This means that it's up to the courts to define domestic violence. The objectives of the Act are to ensure the safety of all persons, including children who experience domestic violence, to reduce and prevent the occurrence of violence within domestic relationships, enacting legislation consistent with the principles underlying the Declaration on the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and enacting provisions that are consistent with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. Domestic and family violence is a serious crime, and it can take many forms, including physical, sexual, psychological, and emotional abuse. It includes behaviour that is threatening, controlling, dominating, intimidating, and even stalking. Examples of domestic violence include controlling family members' finances, depriving them of their liberty, damaging their property, and physically abusing them through the means of slapping, kicking, or punching. A comprehensive review of the Crimes Act was undertaken, and it explains there is no legislation within the Crimes Act relating to culturally appropriate practice to implement within Aboriginal communities. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are far more likely to experience violence, and they suffer more serious violence than non-Indigenous women do. This really highlights the further disadvantage being experienced by Aboriginal women when dealing with the courts. It calls for an immediate action to reform legislation to ensure the community is supporting its most vulnerable individuals. The New South Wales Ministry of Health have developed the New South Wales Domestic and Family Violence Blueprint for Reform 2016 to 2021, which aims to create safer lives for women, men, and children. The blueprint sets out the direction for a domestic violence system that will prevent violence, intervene early with vulnerable communities, support victims, hold perpetrators accountable, and deliver evidence-based quality services to make victims feel safer and support their recovery. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, their children and communities, early intervention within vulnerable communities ensures this population group who are at higher risk of domestic and family violence are identified and supported early. Evidence provided to the Blueprint team suggested this disadvantaged group are more likely to be disengaged from early intervention services. As an example, they are not able to access these services easily due to living in a remote community, or the service itself is not sufficiently culturally competent or helpful for Aboriginal peoples. Another key element for the Aboriginal community is the system-wide coordinated approach to perpetrator interventions, which will better hold individuals to account for their behaviours. More specifically, individualised men's behaviour change programs targeted at Aboriginal communities will provide a range of approaches that are effective to creating changed behaviour that is free of violence. The New South Wales Government's Domestic and Family Violence Prevention and Early Intervention Strategy 2017 to 2021 provides a clear focus on preventing violence before it occurs and intervening early to create safer lives for women, men, and children. The strategy is a commitment of the New South Wales Domestic and Family Violence Blueprint for Reform 2016 to 2021, and it will inform the way New South Wales government agencies, non-government organisations and communities design and deliver prevention and early intervention activities. The rate of reported domestic violence-related assault for Aboriginal females in New South Wales is 4 times higher than for the whole female population. Increased knowledge and understanding about the nature of relationships and experience of abuse in communities where there is such high risk of domestic and family violence will improve the effectiveness of interventions. Identifying where people are marginalised and challenging the stigma and stereotypes that lead to systemic discrimination will improve access to information and support and reduce vulnerability to domestic and family violence. Our Watch have developed the Changing the Picture national resource which supports the prevention of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and their children. Changing the Picture shows how as a society we can work together to change the underlying drivers of violence. Our Watch has worked closely with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to develop the resource. The voices, experiences, knowledge, ideas, decades-long activism and solutions of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are at its core. As a non-Indigenous organisation, Our Watch does not claim to have all the solutions, but they are committed to playing a part in addressing racism, power inequalities and other ongoing impacts of colonisation, and to ultimately work in solidarity with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. By addressing the 3 essential prevention actions, society has an opportunity to prevent violence before it happens in the first place. Our Watch highlights prevention can only be achieved through effective practice and partnership. This resource calls for expansion of and improvements to crisis and response systems, services and processes. These systems must be able to support, assist and respond to the needs of victims, survivors, and also respond more appropriately and effectively to those who perpetrate violence. Continued work to improve both these aspects of the response system is critical. The overwhelming need for effective responses to violence is clear from the scale and severity of the problem. Focusing only on responding to violence fails to address its underlying causes or drivers. Treating the symptoms of a problem can never be enough in the long term. As Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander service providers and advocates have pointed out, this approach also tends to rely heavily on simplistic law and order solutions and as such not only fails to address the root causes of violence and the underlying reasons why individuals come into contact with the justice system in the first place, but also only perpetuates cycles of trauma and disadvantage and will not make our communities safer in the long term. It is only by developing a prevention approach, one that identifies and addresses the deeper drivers of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, that we can start to reduce and ultimately prevent this violence from occurring in the first place. All of us, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous people, communities, organisations and all levels of governments have a responsibility to work together to prevent violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and their children. Aboriginal organisation and services have been identified as key stakeholders in ensuring Aboriginal women and their children are supported when they experience family violence. Aboriginal Legal Service has been providing legal services to Aboriginal people since 1970 in Redfern, New South Wales. They believe it is critical for Aboriginal voices to be heard and respected when it comes to laws and government policies that impact upon their communities. As an organisation who thrives on culturally safe and localised solutions that have the support of the community, they drive the change to ensure better outcomes for families and communities. An organisation built on the notion of culturally safe legal service delivery, supporting men, women and children through representation in court, advice, information, and referral to other supports. The First National's Women's Legal Contact Line offers free confidential legal information, advice and referrals for women in New South Wales with a focus on domestic violence and apprehended violence orders. Similar to the Aboriginal Legal Service in its mission, this women's legal service has pioneered new ways of helping women access the law, providing women with a voice, access to justice, and redress the inequalities that women experience. Warringah Baya is an Aboriginal women's legal centre within the inner west of Sydney, New South Wales, offering services to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, children and youth. They offer legal advice, court support, law reform, community legal education, cultural awareness training and outreach. The Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service provides women and their children with information, advocacy, safety planning where appropriate. They provide referrals to services including housing, counselling, financial assistance or health services. They offer support to Indigenous women before court, at court and after court, which provides and improves their experience of the justice system. Collectively, these services strive towards achieving better outcomes for Aboriginal women and their children. Their collaborative approaches to embedding systemic change shows the magnitude of working together as a community to achieve the same goal, ending family violence in Aboriginal communities. Although services are meeting the immediate needs of women who enter their premises, more must be done to ensure women in remote communities, those specifically falling through the cracks, who are not seen or heard, are supported too. Ultimately, as a state, what we have now is not enough, and more must be continually done to achieve a life free from domestic violence for Aboriginal women and their children. A consequence of addressing family violence within Indigenous communities is that an Indigenous woman may be unable or unwilling to fragment their identity by leaving the community, kin, family, or their partner as a solution to the violence they are experiencing. This can challenge individuals, services, or even family members, as they are forced to sit with the risk of further harm being perpetrated to a vulnerable individual. Engaging Aboriginal women and their children through the promotion of best practice ensures practitioners and policymakers are offering culturally appropriate support that promotes the self-determination of all Indigenous people. Best practice is a round-tabled conversation, which involves all stakeholders. Aboriginal communities have key people who can engage holistically and flexibly with non-Indigenous people to ultimately achieve change. It is clear that Indigenous families and communities in contemporary Australia face immense challenges. Their strength, resilience should be admired, and we should all continue to strive towards dismantling the disadvantage this vulnerable community has endured for far too long. As I conclude today's presentation, I would like to thank the presenters from today, Lana O'Brien and Fadzi Marasha, and thank you all for allowing me the opportunity to shine a light on the catastrophic and deadly epidemic that is family violence through the lens of Aboriginal women, their children, and their communities. Thank you.